She had always moved through the world quietly, as if her presence could be unnoticed and the noise of others could not touch her. In the small apartment she shared with her mother, the soft hum of the city below was often the only sound that kept her company. Yet inside her room, there was another world, one made entirely of music. The piano had been in their home for as long as she could remember, a heavy instrument with chipped keys and a warm, slightly worn finish. To anyone else it might have looked ordinary, even old, but to her it was alive. Every time she touched it, every note she played, she felt a connection that went beyond words. Her mother worked long hours at the local hospital, often coming home exhausted and worn. She would sometimes peek into her daughter's room after a long shift, expecting to find the usual silence, but instead she would hear the piano singing. It was not loud or flashy, but it was rich with emotion, full of feelings that could not be spoken. The girl's music had the power to fill the empty corners of the small apartment, to transform the dull, gray walls into a space of light and warmth. Often, her mother would stop just inside the door and watch quietly, letting the music speak instead of her words. It was a kind of magic neither of them could explain. Despite her talent, she had always been painfully shy. She rarely spoke even to people she knew well. Her voice was soft and careful, and she often feared saying the wrong thing, as if words could betray her inner world. This shyness extended to school, to neighbors, and to anyone outside their small circle. She had friends of a sort, but they were few and cautious, understanding that she preferred to observe rather than join. It was not that she disliked people. She simply felt that her true self existed only when no one else was watching, in the quiet corners where music could breathe freely. The piano was her refuge, her voice, her secret. Each afternoon, after finishing homework, she would sit down at the keys and play until the sun dipped below the buildings. Sometimes she would lose herself entirely, her hands moving across the keys with a confidence that no one else ever saw. Notes would rise and fall, gentle and commanding all at once, forming melodies that were full of sadness, hope, anger, and joy. It was as if the instrument could hear her deepest thoughts and respond in kind. When the music ended, the silence that followed was almost sacred, a brief moment to catch her breath before stepping back into a world where she had to remain quiet. One evening, while playing a piece she had been working on for weeks, her mother entered quietly. She stood behind the girl, listening to the music swirl through the room, and finally asked, "Have you ever thought about playing somewhere else? Somewhere bigger?" The girl paused, her fingers hovering over the keys. "Somewhere else?" she asked softly. "Yes," her mother said, her voice careful, almost shy. "There's a piano competition next month. People from all over the city come. I think maybe you could try. Show them what you can do." The words were like a sudden gust of wind, stirring something inside her. She had always dreamed, in quiet, impossible ways, of being heard beyond the apartment walls. But the thought of stepping into a large hall, in front of strangers, made her stomach twist. She looked down at her hands, uncertain. I don't know," she whispered. Her mother knelt beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I know it's scary," she said, "but you have something special. You let your music speak for you when words cannot. Maybe now is the time to let others hear it too." That night, she lay in bed, thinking. The idea of performing in front of people felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, but there was a strange thrill in it as well. She thought about the piano waiting for her in the living room, the way the keys seemed to respond to her touch like old friends. Could she really share that magic with strangers? Could they feel what she felt every time she played? The thought was both terrifying and exciting. She turned onto her side, staring at the ceiling, the faint hum of the city below blending with the echo of imaginary music in her mind. In the days that followed, she wrestled with the idea. Every time she sat at the piano, her mind wandered to the competition, to the judges, to the audience. The images made her anxious, but they also inspired her to practice with more intensity than ever before. She would play early in the morning, late into the night, experimenting with new melodies, refining old ones, pushing herself to explore the full range of emotion that her music could convey. Each note was a small victory, a quiet step toward something that felt both distant and necessary. Her mother watched these practices with quiet pride. She never forced her, never pushed too hard, understanding that her daughter needed to take this journey in her own time. But she also understood the courage it would take, the strength hidden behind the quiet exterior. Every time the girl played, her mother felt a spark of hope, a belief that something extraordinary was waiting just beyond the horizon. One afternoon, she received a flyer in the mail about the piano competition. It was glossy, colorful, filled with images of grand pianos and serious-looking judges. She held it in her hands, turning it over again and again, the letters blurring as she tried to imagine herself on that stage. It felt impossible and yet inevitable, like the first breath of spring after a long, cold winter. She could almost hear the applause that might follow, almost feel the excitement that might ripple through her chest. And yet, the fear lingered, cold and persistent. Her friends at school noticed the change in her, though no one asked directly. She moved with a new intensity, often staring into space as if composing melodies in her head. Her teachers noticed her improved focus, her growing confidence in music class. But she still barely spoke, still avoided attention. The piano was her world, her language, and she guarded it closely, even as she prepared to share it with the world. The night before she decided to enter the competition, she sat alone at the piano, the room bathed in the golden glow of a single lamp. She ran her fingers over the keys, feeling the smooth, worn surfaces beneath her fingertips. She played a piece she had been practicing for months, a complex melody full of highs and lows, sorrow and hope. As she played, she imagined the hall, the lights, the judges, the audience waiting. She imagined herself standing in front of them, her hands moving like they always did, her heart pouring out in notes rather than words. When the last note faded, she sat back, breathless. The silence that followed felt different than usual. It was not empty. It was filled with possibility. She looked at the piano, at the instrument that had been her closest companion for as long as she could remember, and she realized she was ready. Not completely, not without fear, but ready enough to step into a world that might finally see her for who she really was. The next morning, she filled out the entry form for the competition. Her hands shook slightly as she wrote her name, but she kept going, each stroke of the pen a quiet declaration of courage. She folded the form carefully, slipped it into the envelope, and handed it to her mother, who smiled with a mixture of pride and relief. The journey was beginning, and though the path ahead was uncertain, it was also bright with promise. In the days leading up to the competition, she continued to practice, more determined than ever. She experimented with her music, exploring new rhythms and dynamics, finding ways to make each note carry emotion. She imagined the judges sitting silently, waiting to be moved, and she knew she had the power to reach them, even without words. Her music had always been her voice, and now it would speak louder than ever before. She rarely talked about her feelings during this time. When asked by her mother or teachers, she would simply nod or shake her head, letting the music do the explaining for her. She had learned that words could be messy, imprecise, and often inadequate. The piano was different. The piano told the truth, without hesitation, without fear, and she was ready to let that truth be heard. As the first day of the competition approached, a quiet excitement grew inside her. It was not the kind of loud, brash excitement that others might show. It was a gentle, persistent warmth, like sunlight breaking through clouds after a long rain. She packed her sheet music carefully, polished the piano shoes she would wear, and made sure her hair was tidy, though she knew none of that mattered compared to what would come from her fingers. On the morning of the event, she walked through the busy streets of the city with her mother. People hurried past, talking and laughing, unaware of the quiet girl moving among them. She kept her eyes on the ground, her thoughts on the music she would play. The world seemed louder than usual, the noises sharper, but she welcomed it. She had always moved through noise before. Now she would move through it with purpose. When they reached the venue, she felt a mixture of fear and anticipation. The doors opened into a large hall, gleaming and intimidating, filled with pianos and people. Competitors were warming up, their confident movements and practiced smiles making her heart beat faster. She swallowed, trying to steady herself, and felt her mother's hand on her shoulder. "You can do this," her mother said softly. "Just let the music speak." She nodded, her fingers twitching as if already preparing to play. The piano waited, patient and silent, ready to transform her quiet courage into something the world could hear. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of possibility settle around her. This was the first step, the moment before the journey truly began. And as she looked at the keys, she felt a spark of something she had never felt before. The thrilling certainty that her music could touch hearts, even in silence. She was shy, she barely spoke, and the world might not yet be ready for her. But the piano knew, and that was enough. The morning of the competition arrived with a quiet, persistent tension. She woke earlier than usual, her stomach twisting with nervous energy. The city outside was alive with movement. Cars honking, buses rumbling, people talking. But inside her small apartment, there was only the soft echo of anticipation. She dressed carefully, choosing simple clothes that would not draw attention, though she knew the clothes were not important. The piano would be her voice today, and nothing else mattered. Her mother made a small breakfast, keeping the atmosphere calm. They ate quietly, exchanging only a few words, because neither of them needed to speak much. The nervousness hung in the air, but it was softened by a shared understanding. Her mother could see the determination in her daughter's eyes, and she knew that no words could prepare her fully. All that could be done now was to trust that the music she had practiced for months would carry her through. When they arrived at the competition hall, the sheer scale of the place made her pause. The doors opened into a vast space, with a high ceiling that echoed with every footstep. Rows of chairs stretched across the polished floor, and grand pianos stood at intervals, their glossy surfaces gleaming under the bright lights. People were already milling about, contestants warming up, judges reviewing notes, families finding seats. But for a moment, she felt invisible. She was just another face in a crowd, another nervous competitor waiting for her turn. Her mother guided her gently to the registration table, where a young woman handed her a small number badge and pointed toward the waiting area. She nodded silently, slipping the badge onto her shirt. The moment felt heavy, almost unreal. She walked past other competitors, noticing their confident smiles and practiced movements. They seemed certain of themselves, as if performing in front of an audience was the most natural thing in the world. In contrast, she felt her heart pounding, her palms sweating, yet beneath the fear, a quiet resolve was growing. She could do this. She had to. Sitting in the waiting area, she opened her music folder and glanced at the sheet music she had memorized so many times. Her fingers brushed the edges of the paper, almost reverently. Each note, each pause, each delicate marking reminded her of hours spent alone, learning how to express feelings she could not put into words. She imagined the keys beneath her hands, the way they would respond to her touch, the way the music would rise and fall like her own heartbeat. For the first time that morning, a small spark of calm spread through her chest. The piano had been with her through everything. It would not let her down. Around her, the atmosphere was tense. Some contestants whispered to their coaches or friends, while others sat silently, headphones on, practicing silently in their minds. The room was filled with a mixture of excitement and anxiety, a kind of charged stillness that made every small sound feel louder. She noticed one girl in particular, sitting nearby, tapping her fingers on the piano bench as if already composing an audience in her mind. The confidence was impressive, almost intimidating, but she reminded herself that it did not matter. She did not need to be the loudest or the fastest. She needed only to be herself and let the music speak. Time moved slowly, each minute stretching like a long, taut string. Finally, a competition official appeared and began calling names, directing contestants toward the stage. Her number was called, and her heart leapt into her throat. She stood slowly, smoothing her hands over her skirt, and followed the official through a corridor lined with observers and other participants. The air grew warmer, heavier, filled with the soft hum of expectation. Every step toward the stage was a test of courage, but she reminded herself that this was only another part of the journey she had already begun. When she stepped onto the stage, the bright lights made her squint for a moment. The room seemed larger than before, filled with rows of seats that were empty now but would soon hold an audience. The judges sat behind a long table, their expressions unreadable. She felt the weight of their eyes, though they had not yet looked at her directly. The piano waited silently, its polished keys reflecting the lights above. She approached it slowly, almost reverently, and lifted the lid, hearing the subtle, familiar sound of its inner strings. She took a deep breath, settling herself onto the bench. The audience was quiet, the silence pressing against her. She could feel the tension in the air, the mixture of expectation and curiosity. Many of the people watching had likely never seen her before, never heard her play. They did not know the depth of feeling she carried in her music. And that was exactly how she wanted it. She did not need to talk, did not need to explain herself. She only needed to play, and let the notes carry the story her voice could not. Her hands moved to the keys, hesitant at first, as if testing the air, testing the room, testing herself. Then, softly, a single note rang out. It was delicate, almost fragile, but it captured something deeper than sound alone. The judges shifted slightly, one raising an eyebrow, another leaning forward. The room seemed to hold its breath. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the music flow from her heart through her fingers. Each note followed naturally, weaving a melody that rose and fell like waves. At first, the audience seemed unsure what to expect. The quiet beginning contrasted sharply with the confident, bold performances they had seen earlier. But gradually the melody grew, moving with precision and emotion. The gentle notes became intricate passages, full of subtle power. Her hands moved with a skill that spoke of years of practice, but also of something more: intuitive understanding, deep feeling. Every key she pressed seemed alive, responding to her touch, creating a sound that was hers alone. The judges exchanged glances. Some leaned closer, their initial skepticism giving way to surprise. They had expected a timid, uncertain performance, but what they heard was commanding and full of life. The music was not loud in a conventional sense, but it filled the hall, reaching every corner, touching every listener. It was as if the piano itself had become her voice, and through it, she told a story no words could capture. She played with the intensity of someone who had lived her entire life in silence, finally finding a way to be heard. Her music carried sorrow and hope, fragility and strength, fear and courage. Every pause, every accent, every lingering note was deliberate, a choice meant to reach the hearts of those listening. She could feel the tension in the room, the shift in energy as the audience leaned forward, captivated by the sound. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. She barely noticed time, lost in the flow of her own creation. Each note was a heartbeat, each chord a breath, each melody a story. She did not look at the judges, did not glance at the audience. She only saw the keys, only felt the music, only trusted the connection she had cultivated for so long. The piano had always been her companion, and now it was her partner in speaking a language that no one could ignore. When the final note lingered in the air and faded into silence, the hall remained still. The audience did not move immediately, as if the sound had temporarily frozen time. She sat quietly, hands resting lightly on the keys, heart pounding. The silence was powerful, heavy with emotion, with unspoken recognition. The music had done what words could not. It had captured attention, commanded respect, and conveyed a depth of feeling that could not be denied. The judges blinked, some exchanging subtle nods, others allowing themselves small smiles of astonishment. One leaned forward, writing notes quickly, clearly impressed. The quiet girl who had barely spoken had done what so many confident performers had failed to achieve. She had stunned them with the purity and strength of her playing. The realization settled in her chest slowly, almost gently. She had faced her fear, stepped into the unknown, and created something extraordinary. As she rose from the bench, the applause began. It was soft at first, then louder, spreading through the hall like a ripple on water. She looked up for the first time, seeing the audience leaning forward, some smiling, some with eyes wide in amazement. Her mother, standing quietly at the edge of the hall, clapped with tears in her eyes. She had believed in her all along, but even she could not have predicted the sheer power of her daughter's performance. The applause continued as she walked off the stage, her steps careful but certain. Inside, she felt a mixture of relief and exhilaration. Fear had been present, yes, but it had been transformed into something greater. She had spoken through music, had shared her soul without saying a single word, and the world had listened. For the first time, she understood that her quiet nature was not a weakness but a strength, that her shyness allowed her to hear and feel in ways others could not. Back in the waiting area, the next contestants were preparing, unaware of the performance that had just taken place. She sat quietly, letting the adrenaline settle, listening to the hum of voices around her. She smiled softly, a private acknowledgement of her own courage. The journey was far from over, the competition still ongoing, but she had already accomplished something remarkable. She had stepped into a larger world and allowed her music to speak for her. For the rest of the day, people would remember the quiet girl who barely spoke and yet commanded attention with nothing but her hands on the keys. Judges would comment on the depth of feeling, the precision of technique, and the emotional power of the performance. Audience members would whisper among themselves, sharing astonishment and admiration, and she would continue, quietly, letting the music guide her, trusting that her voice, though wordless, was strong enough to reach anyone willing to listen. She had entered the hall unsure of herself, but she left with a growing confidence, a quiet assurance that the path she had chosen, the path of music, of expression beyond words, was the right one. The competition was only the beginning, and she knew that as long as she trusted in herself and in her piano, there was no limit to what she could achieve. The world might not always understand, might not always notice, but through music, she would be heard. The moment she stepped onto the stage for her performance, the bright lights made her pause. For an instant, she felt the weight of every eye in the hall, the hundreds of people waiting to see her, and the panel of judges who had been trained to detect every flaw. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear alone, but from the intensity of anticipation. The piano sat before her, glossy and immaculate, a new instrument compared to the one she had practiced on for years. Yet she welcomed it. It was familiar in a way only music could make things familiar, and she instinctively knew it would respond to her touch. She approached the piano slowly, her steps measured. The hall seemed to stretch endlessly, every sound amplified by the high ceiling and polished floors. She glanced at the judges briefly, noting their composed expressions, unreadable and serious. They had seen countless performers, each one trying to impress with flashy skills or dramatic presence. They had probably never expected someone like her, a quiet, unassuming girl, to stand in front of them. But that was precisely why she felt a flicker of quiet confidence. She didn't need to dazzle with words or presence. She only needed to let her hands speak. She seated herself, her posture straight but relaxed. She lifted her hands over the keys and closed her eyes for a moment, drawing in a deep, steadying breath. The room was silent, save for the soft murmur of the audience settling into their seats. She could feel their expectation pressing down, almost tangible, yet she let it wash over her without panic. In that moment, the world narrowed to her fingers and the piano, to the delicate bridge between thought and sound. Her first note was soft, almost hesitant, but it lingered with a surprising clarity. The judges leaned slightly forward, curious. She allowed the next few notes to follow naturally, each one deliberate and flowing, like water over stones. The melody was gentle, melodic, yet unmistakably alive. Her fingers moved with a precision born from countless hours of practice. But there was more than skill in her playing. There was emotion, pure and raw, carefully shaped into music that reached beyond the room's walls. As the first section of her piece progressed, the audience began to lean in. The quiet beginning had drawn them in, uncertain but attentive. They did not yet know the depth of what was to come, but the subtle richness of the sound captured their curiosity. She did not glance at anyone in the crowd, did not shift to seek approval or reassurance. Her eyes remained closed for a brief moment, her mind fully attuned to the movement of her hands and the response of the piano. Each note was a word, each chord a sentence, each rising and falling scale a paragraph of unspoken story. Gradually, the melody grew bolder, more commanding. The soft, gentle passages were punctuated by bursts of emotion. Rapid scales that danced across the keyboard, chords that thundered softly yet powerfully, filling the hall with sound that seemed to resonate in every corner. The judges exchanged subtle glances, some eyebrows rising in surprise, others leaning closer, clearly captivated. The audience, too, responded unconsciously, drawn into the ebb and flow of the music. There were no gasps or dramatic reactions yet, only the quiet absorption of those who recognized that something extraordinary was unfolding before them. She felt her heart synchronize with the rhythm of her playing. Each note carried a weight, a meaning she could not put into words, and each pause was intentional, a breath in the conversation between her and the piano. Memories of lonely afternoons, quiet evenings, and secret practice sessions poured into her music. The years of quiet observation, the private joys and sorrows, all transformed into sound. She did not need to explain herself. The piano spoke for her, and as she played, she could feel that the audience sensed it too. Midway through the performance, a delicate yet intense section emerged. Her fingers danced with confidence and precision, moving across the keys in patterns that seemed impossible to execute so flawlessly. The sound shifted between tender whispers and sharp declarations, capturing both fragility and strength. Some in the audience leaned forward, eyes wide, drawn into the story unfolding in real time. She could almost hear their hearts beating along with hers, responding to the emotional cadence she had woven. The judges scribbled notes, nodding subtly, each one impressed by the combination of technical mastery and expressive depth. There were moments when she felt the familiar tremor of doubt, brief flashes of anxiety that she might stumble or lose the flow. But she pushed through it, letting the music carry her beyond fear. She thought of her mother, of the hours spent in quiet practice, of the life she had built around the piano, and each thought strengthened her resolve. She realized that the performance was not about perfection. It was about truth. It was about sharing a part of herself that had always existed quietly, waiting for this moment. As the piece reached its climax, the sound swelled, filling the hall completely. Her hands moved with increasing intensity, striking chords that resonated like waves crashing against rocks. The gentle beginnings had given way to a powerful surge of emotion, a crescendo that left the audience breathless. She could feel the energy in the room shifting, a collective recognition of something rare and beautiful. The judges' eyes were fixed on her, expressions softening, reflecting awe rather than scrutiny. She could feel the impact of her music in the silence between the notes, in the way it lingered in the air, touching hearts without a single word spoken. Every section of the piece seemed to tell a different part of her story. The quiet, tender passages reflected the shy, reserved girl who had spent years observing the world without speaking. The bold, dramatic sections captured her hidden courage and strength. The delicate, intricate patterns mirrored her sensitivity and attention to detail. Each element was carefully balanced, a reflection of her inner life made audible. The piano, once a silent companion, had become an extension of herself, a vessel through which the world could finally understand her. As the final notes approached, she allowed them to linger, letting each chord resonate fully before moving to the next. The hall was silent, the audience caught in a moment of suspended time. She pressed the final chord, held it, and then let it fade naturally, allowing the silence to fill the space. When it ended, the stillness was profound. For a heartbeat, there was no sound at all, only the echo of her music and the soft rustle of anticipation. She opened her eyes slowly, taking in the room, the audience, and the judges, and for the first time, she truly saw the impact of her performance. The applause began softly, almost tentatively, as if the audience were testing whether what they had heard was real. Then it grew steadily, spreading through the hall like a wave. Hands clapped, some standing, others leaning forward in admiration. Faces reflected astonishment, joy, and appreciation. She sat still for a moment, allowing herself to absorb it, letting the realization sink in that she had reached them, that she had spoken without words, and they had listened. The judges were the first to rise. Their expressions were composed, but the subtle smiles and nods of acknowledgement were unmistakable. They had heard many performances, but few had combined quiet vulnerability and technical mastery so effortlessly. Notes were exchanged, pens scribbling observations, but beneath the professional assessment was a shared recognition. This was a performance that transcended evaluation. It was a moment of connection, a fleeting glimpse of pure artistry that left an impression far beyond the score. She rose from the piano bench, feeling a mixture of relief, exhilaration, and quiet pride. Her hands were slightly trembling, her heart pounding, but it was a different kind of intensity now, one of accomplishment, not fear. She walked slowly off the stage, letting the applause wash over her, aware that she had just shared a part of herself that no one could take away. In that moment, she understood that her shyness and quiet nature had not been obstacles. They had been the foundation for something uniquely powerful. Backstage, her mother waited, eyes shining with tears of pride. She embraced her quietly, whispering words of encouragement that barely needed to be said. The music had spoken louder than any sentence could, conveying everything that words might have failed to capture. Others around them were congratulating her, but she barely heard them. She was still wrapped in the echo of her own creation, in the knowledge that she had given everything she had to the piano and to the audience, and it had been enough. The remainder of the day blurred into a mixture of waiting and observation. Other competitors performed, some impressive, some less so, but none could quite capture the quiet intensity that she had brought to the stage. She watched from the side, attentive but detached, letting each performance pass without comparison. She had discovered something in herself that day, a newfound understanding of her own courage and voice. The recognition she had received was validating, yes, but the real reward was the knowledge that she had expressed herself fully, without compromise. As the day drew to a close, the judges conferred, occasionally glancing at their notes, occasionally discussing the performances quietly among themselves. She waited patiently, knowing that the outcome, while important, could not define the experience she had just lived. She had faced the fear of being seen, had trusted herself, and had created something beautiful. That knowledge carried a weight far greater than any award could provide. When she finally left the hall that evening, the city lights shimmering outside, she walked slowly with her mother at her side. The streets were alive with movement, but she felt detached from it, wrapped in the private glow of accomplishment. The music she had played earlier still resonated within her, echoing like a memory of something sacred. She had spoken without words, and for the first time, she knew the power that came from embracing who she truly was. That night, she sat at her old piano at home, fingers hovering over the familiar keys. She played softly, letting the notes flow, not for an audience, not for judges, but for herself. The music was different now, enriched by the knowledge that it could reach beyond the walls of her apartment, beyond the confines of her own fear. The quiet girl who had barely spoken had discovered a voice strong enough to move others, a voice that could exist in silence yet be heard across any distance. After the performance, the hall seemed to linger in a quiet afterglow, as if the music itself had left an invisible echo that refused to fade. She stepped back from the stage, her legs feeling strangely light and heavy at the same time. Relief washed over her, mingled with a nervous excitement she could hardly name. She had done it. She had played her heart out, shared her deepest emotions, and for the first time, she felt seen, even if it was only through sound. Backstage, a few people approached to offer congratulations, but their voices seemed distant. She nodded quietly, smiled faintly, but her thoughts were still with the music she had just released. It was like letting a bird fly from a cage. She could watch it soar, but part of her still wanted to hold it close. The piano had been her companion for years, and now it had carried her beyond the walls of her apartment, into a space where strangers could feel her story without a single word being spoken. Her mother was waiting at the side of the stage, hands clasped together, eyes wide with pride. She had seen the transformation happen in real time, had witnessed the shy, barely speaking girl become a storyteller without words. Her mother's smile said everything words could not. There were no congratulations needed, no praise necessary. The music had done all of that. Meanwhile, in the audience, whispers began to ripple among the listeners. People were sharing their surprise, their admiration, their astonishment that someone so quiet, so unassuming, could command a room so completely. Some leaned toward one another, speaking in hushed tones about how the performance had moved them. The piece had started softly, almost unnoticeable, but it had built with emotion and precision until it became a force impossible to ignore. It was clear that the judges, who had been so serious and reserved, had also been caught completely off guard. The judges were still seated, scribbling notes, exchanging subtle nods, and murmuring quietly among themselves. At first, their expressions had been neutral, perhaps even skeptical, as they had observed her entrance and quiet demeanor. But as the performance progressed, their skepticism had melted away, replaced by genuine appreciation. They were no longer just assessing technical skill. They were witnessing the result of deep passion, unwavering dedication, and a rare emotional resonance that transcended the usual expectations of a competition. One judge leaned forward, lowering her pen for a moment, eyes fixed on the stage. The notes they had been taking now seemed secondary to the impact of what had been played. Another judge, who had seemed stern and detached throughout the day, exhaled slowly. His expression softened, almost awed. He had seen countless performers over the years, but few had managed to combine technical skill with such profound emotional depth. The performance was simple in some ways, unpretentious, but every note had meaning, every pause was deliberate. It was as if the piano had been a bridge between her heart and the hearts of everyone listening. Outside the hall, word of her performance began to spread quickly. People who had watched the competition on live streams, or heard accounts from friends who attended, were talking about the quiet girl who had stunned everyone. Social media posts began to surface, praising her subtle strength, her ability to communicate so powerfully without speaking, and her undeniable talent. She was unaware of this at the time, but the ripples of her music were spreading far beyond the walls of that hall. Backstage, she took a seat, letting the adrenaline slowly fade. She tried to breathe normally, but her chest was still tight from the intensity of the performance. She kept her hands folded in her lap, fingers occasionally brushing against one another as if trying to anchor herself. She did not feel like a winner or a loser. She felt something more complicated, something entirely new. She had shared a part of herself that had been hidden for so long, and she had seen it reflected in the reactions of others. The sense of connection, though wordless, was overwhelming. Her mother leaned over and whispered softly, "They've never seen anyone play like that." She didn't need to elaborate. The expression on her mother's face was enough to confirm that she had succeeded in conveying what she had wanted all along. There was a quiet pride, a recognition that years of solitary practice and dedication had culminated in this single moment of truth. The shyness that had always defined her seemed irrelevant now. The piano had spoken, and she had finally been heard. Meanwhile, the other competitors continued their performances. Some were impressive, with flashy techniques and dramatic flair, but the emotional weight of her music lingered in the minds of many. The hall seemed different now, as if it had been transformed by what had occurred earlier. Those who had been skeptical or distracted were now listening more carefully, realizing that a quiet, understated performance could carry more power than the loudest or most confident display. It was a lesson in presence, subtlety, and authenticity. As the day moved on, judges began discussing the performances more openly. The quiet girl's name came up repeatedly. One judge commented on the clarity of her technique, another on the precision of her timing. But more importantly, All agreed that her performance had an emotional resonance that was difficult to quantify. It was clear that she had communicated something profoundly human, something that could not be captured in numbers or rankings alone. Her music had touched people on a level deeper than skill. It had reached into the heart. The audience continued to talk in quiet clusters during intermissions, recounting moments that had moved them. Some described how their breath had caught during a delicate passage, how their eyes had widened as the music swelled unexpectedly, how they had felt tears welling up without understanding why. Every description mirrored the experience of everyone who had listened with attention, confirming that her impact was real and undeniable. Even those who did not usually attend competitions, or who had been casual observers, were moved. The story her music told was universal, even without a single word spoken. Later, when the results were being prepared, she waited backstage, her mind surprisingly calm. She felt proud, yes, but she did not dwell on victory or recognition. The music itself had been the reward. She remembered every careful practice session, every moment spent alone at the piano, the hours spent perfecting each note. All of that had led to this, a culmination of patience, persistence, and quiet determination. It was a validation not just of talent, but of the value of staying true to oneself even when it seemed easier to conform or compete for attention. Her mother stayed close, occasionally touching her hand or brushing a strand of hair from her face. The connection between them was strong, unspoken, but profound. They had shared the journey together, and now, in the aftermath, the pride and love were palpable. There were no words needed to express the depth of the experience. They had been communicated fully in music, in silence, and in understanding glances. Finally, the moment arrived when the judges called the competitors back to the stage. One by one, names were announced, and awards were distributed. When her name was called, the reaction immediate. Applause filled the hall once again, and she walked forward with a mixture of quiet dignity and restrained excitement. She accepted the acknowledgement without fanfare, smiling softly but without elaborate gestures. The music had spoken for her. The award was simply an external confirmation of what had already been expressed. In the days following the competition, the impact of her performance became more evident. Teachers, friends, and even strangers who had attended the event spoke of her with admiration. Invitations to perform at small recitals began to arrive, along with notes from people touched by her playing. It was overwhelming in a way she had never anticipated, but she welcomed it with quiet gratitude. The shy girl who had barely spoken had created something that moved people, and she began to understand that her quiet strength was now being recognized on a larger scale. Despite the newfound attention, she remained modest. She continued to practice in her small apartment, finding comfort in familiar routines. She played not for accolades, but because the piano was her voice, her sanctuary, and her constant companion. The applause and praise were gratifying, but they were not the reason she played. The real reward was the connection she could forge through music, the ability to reach others in ways that words alone could not. Her mother often watched her, quietly marveling at the transformation. The girl had always been talented, but now there was a confidence in her posture, a subtle glow in her eyes that had not existed before. It was not arrogance or showiness. It was a quiet certainty, born of self-trust and the knowledge that she could communicate her heart to others. The world was beginning to notice, but more importantly, she was beginning to notice herself. Even weeks later, the memory of that performance lingered. The echoes of the notes, the reactions of the audience, the subtle shifts in the judges' expressions, they all remained vivid in her mind. She understood that a single performance, though brief, could have a lasting impact when it was filled with sincerity and heart. She had discovered a power within herself that went beyond skill, beyond fear, and even beyond recognition. It was a power that could move hearts quietly, profoundly, and without need for words. Her life had not changed in every way, but it had shifted in meaningful ways. She walked taller, spoke slightly more, and engaged with the world in small, subtle ways that reflected her growing confidence. The piano remained her closest companion, but now she carried the knowledge that her music could reach beyond the apartment, beyond the stage, and touch the lives of people she had never met. That awareness was both humbling and inspiring, a reminder of what could happen when one trusted in talent, effort, and the courage to be vulnerable. And so, life continued, quieter than most, but richer in meaning. The shy girl who barely spoke had begun to find her voice in a way that could not be ignored. The piano had done more than carry music. It had carried her, her story, and the possibility of a future in which she would never again doubt the power she held within. The weeks following the competition passed in a quiet, steady rhythm. She returned to her small apartment, to the piano that had been her lifelong companion, but the world around her had shifted subtly. People who had heard her play were still talking about it, and invitations for small performances began to arrive. She had never imagined such attention, yet it was not the recognition itself that mattered most. It was the awareness that her music could reach others, could move hearts, and could tell stories that words could not capture. At first, she hesitated to accept these invitations. The thought of stepping into another hall, of being in front of more strangers, was intimidating. But with each passing day, the memory of the judges' astonished expressions and the audience's captivated silence strengthened her resolve. She reminded herself that this was not about being brave in the traditional sense. It was about trusting the connection she had discovered with the piano, trusting that her music could speak for her even when her voice could not. Her first performance after the competition was at a small recital hall. It was modest compared to the grand stage she had faced before, but the audience was no less important to her. She arrived early, setting her sheet music and polishing the keys with care. She ran her fingers lightly over the keyboard, feeling the familiar grooves and smooth surfaces, the echoes of years spent practicing alone. A calm settled over her as she sat on the bench, as if the piano itself was reminding her that she was ready. The lights dimmed, and the audience quieted. She looked up briefly, seeing a mix of familiar faces and strangers who had come to hear her perform. Her hands hovered over the keys, and for a moment, the familiar nervousness returned. Then she drew in a deep breath, closed her eyes, and began to play. The notes rose softly, like a whisper, weaving through the air with delicate precision. She felt herself melt into the music, her body moving almost unconsciously with the rhythm and flow of the melody. This time, she was not performing to impress, to win, or to be recognized. She was performing to share, to communicate the emotions she had always carried inside. Each chord was an invitation, each phrase a gentle request for the audience to feel as she felt. The room responded in silence, every listener drawn into the intimate space she created. Some leaned forward, some closed their eyes, and some simply let the music wash over them, allowing it to fill corners of their hearts they did not know were empty. Afterward, when she left the stage, she felt a sense of fulfillment she had never experienced before. The applause was warm and genuine, but she was more aware of the quiet energy she had left behind, the invisible thread connecting her music to the audience's emotions. That connection, that ability to touch people without speaking, had become the truest reward she had ever known. Word of her performances spread slowly but steadily. She received letters and messages from people who had been moved by her music. Some were simple notes of admiration. Others told stories of how the melodies had helped them through difficult times, had brought comfort, or had awakened forgotten memories. She read these messages quietly, a small smile forming on her lips, feeling the impact of her music ripple further than she could have imagined. She realized that even though she barely spoke, her voice, through the piano, was being heard across distances, touching lives she would never see. Her mother watched these developments with quiet pride. She had always known the depth of her daughter's talent, but she now saw the world begin to recognize it as well. Yet she never pushed her daughter to perform more often than she wanted. She understood that the courage required to share music so intimately was not something that could be demanded. It had to be nurtured and respected. And so, she continued to offer gentle encouragement, celebrating every small success without making the pressure unbearable. Over time, she began to feel a subtle transformation within herself. The shy, reserved girl who had once feared attention now carried a quiet confidence. She still spoke softly, still preferred observation over conversation, but she understood her own strength in ways she had never known before. The piano had been the bridge, the safe space, the translator of emotions she could not verbalize. Through it, she realized that being quiet was not a limitation, but a gift. It allowed her to hear more, feel more, and express more profoundly than many who spoke freely ever could. One afternoon, she received an invitation to perform at a larger venue, a concert hall known for hosting professional musicians. It was daunting, and the thought of the hundreds of seats waiting for her made her stomach tighten. She hesitated, weighing her nerves against the opportunity. Her mother encouraged her gently, reminding her that she had already faced such challenges before and had succeeded. The girl reflected on the journey she had undertaken, from quiet afternoons at home to the competition hall, and realized that the music had always guided her. She accepted the invitation, knowing that it was not just about performing, but about continuing to share a part of herself with the world. Preparation for the concert was both exciting and meticulous. She spent hours rehearsing, experimenting with subtle nuances in her pieces, ensuring that every note conveyed the depth she intended. She envisioned the audience, not as a crowd of strangers, but as individuals whose hearts she hoped to touch. She remembered the lessons she had learned, the power of patience, the importance of authenticity, and the quiet confidence that comes from trusting in one's own abilities. Each practice session reinforced the bond between her and the piano, a connection that no stage, no audience, and no fear could break. The day of the concert arrived. She walked into the hall early, absorbing the grandeur of the space, the polished wooden floors, the towering ceilings. Despite the intimidation, a calm focus settled over her. She approached the piano, lifting the lid, running her hands lightly over the keys. The familiar feeling grounded her, and for a moment, she closed her eyes, letting the silence and anticipation dissolve into calm energy. When the audience quieted, she seated herself, took a deep breath, and began to play. The music unfolded naturally, weaving a tapestry of emotion that was at once delicate and powerful. She allowed herself to feel everything: the memories of practice, the joy of sharing, the quiet moments of doubt and triumph. Each phrase carried meaning, each pause invited reflection, and each chord resonated deeply. The audience was captivated, leaning forward, holding their breath at the delicate passages, and releasing slowly as the music soared. The hall seemed to exist in a separate time, a place shaped entirely by the melody she created. By the end of the concert, she had transformed both the space and herself. The applause was thunderous, yet it felt secondary to the satisfaction of knowing that she had shared her deepest self. She rose from the piano, hands slightly trembling, heart full, and allowed herself to smile genuinely. Her mother was among the first to stand, clapping with a proud, tearful expression. The recognition was real, but more importantly, it was grounded in truth. The truth that music had given her a voice she had once doubted, and the courage to continue using it. In the days that followed, opportunities expanded. She was invited to teach masterclasses, perform at smaller festivals, and collaborate with other musicians. Each opportunity brought new challenges and new growth. She remained humble, understanding that every performance was a chance to share, not to prove. Her shyness remained, but it was tempered with a quiet strength, a confidence that came from knowing her music could speak for her even when she barely did. She continued to practice every day, maintaining the discipline that had shaped her from the beginning. The piano remained her closest companion, a constant source of comfort and expression. Yet now, she could see the fruits of her dedication reflected in the reactions of others, in the connections her music created. She understood that talent alone was not enough. It was the willingness to share, to be vulnerable, and to trust that the music could reach beyond herself that made the difference. Over time, she began to speak slightly more, not out of necessity, but as a reflection of her growing confidence. She still preferred silence, still cherished moments of solitude, but she found that the courage to express herself through music had gradually extended into other parts of her life. She could smile more freely, engage in conversation with a sense of calm, and connect with people in ways that had once felt impossible. The The piano had not just given her a voice. It had taught her the strength to inhabit the world on her own terms. Years later, she would look back on the competition that had changed everything and remember it as a turning point. It was not just the applause, the recognition, or the awards that mattered. It was the realization that she could overcome fear, that she could share her inner self authentically, and that the quietest voices can often have the most profound impact. She had begun as a girl who barely spoke, unsure of herself, and had grown into a musician whose music could stop a room, move hearts, and inspire others. The journey continued, as journeys do, but she no longer feared being seen. She had learned that her quiet strength, her patience, and her dedication were powerful tools, and that music would always be there to guide her. She played not for fame, not for applause, but because it was who she was, and in that truth she found freedom. The shy girl who had once doubted her own voice had discovered something far greater: the courage to be herself, the power to touch others, and the knowledge that music could speak even when words failed. And so, she played, again and again, quietly, humbly, yet with the profound impact of someone who had learned to trust herself. Her piano continued to sing, her hands continued to move, and her music continued to inspire everyone who paused to listen. She had barely spoken, yet through the piano, she had spoken more clearly than anyone could have imagined.